Paradigm. The taken for granted assumptions of the paradigm are linked to taken for granted ways of doing things. And that's where the cultural web comes in. The cultural web's a model which helps explain these links and, in turn, the links to strategy development and strategic change. Let's take an example. The UK National Health Service has been going through attempts to change over many years. Here's a cultural web drawn up by managers in the NHS. What does it show? Well, it shows that in terms of taken for granted assumptions, patient care is central. But it's patient care our way. The providers know best. Those providers are quite fragmented, and that's reflected in the power structures of the NHS. So power and paradigm tend to be linked. But the acute sector, the hospitals, tend to be a dominant force in the NHS. In terms of organisational structure, the NHS is very mechanistic, very hierarchical, but it's also tribal. There's the doctors in primary care, and in the acute sector there's the nurses, tribes of influence, if you will. The control systems tend to be pretty mechanistic and externally imposed in terms of target setting, for example. If you look at the rituals and routines in the health service, they tend to reflect the attitudes towards patients. There are clinical rituals which you'll experience if you go into hospital, for example. Consultation ceremonies where you go to see the specialists. Putting patients to bed. One of the managers in the NHS referred to it as patient infantilizing, putting patients in their place, getting them to bed at particular times, waking them up at particular times, giving them tea at particular times, and so on. If you look at the stories that the people in the NHS tell each other and tell people who are associated with the NHS, they tend to be about the golden age of the past, wonder cures of the future. And indeed the wonder cures have become seen to be symbols in terms of high-tech solutions to problems in the NHS. And there are other symbols, of course, which you are very familiar with, the white coats in hospitals, the big institutions, very often with royal in front of them, and so on. Now, what does all this tell us? Essentially, what it is telling us is some key messages that help explain the difficulties of change. This is a fragmented organisation in terms of power, but it's a fragmented organisation that tends to look to its history, to look to its traditions, and to look to its symbols and stories which relate to those traditions. Now, you might see that for a really successful organisation, the culture that we've just described here could be one of the bases of its success, indeed one of the bases of its competitive advantage. There's a fine dividing line between an organisation's culture and its core competencies, for example. But perhaps you can also see that as that organisation over time is successful, then the culture becomes more entrenched, more embedded, and more difficult to change.